So, welcome everybody to our lunch and learn today, Prop 65 in a nutshell. So, I'm Bruce Calder. I'm the VP of Consulting Services here at Claigan. I'm going to be your host today. This is actually an education that we do internally that we're putting up on the web so everybody can benefit from all this stuff. So, Claigan, most of you guys know Claigan. We provided Prop 65 compliance for thousands of products. We've done justifications of why a warning is not required, or if a warning is required, what substances do you have to warn for, like that one, DHP. And more complicated things, when you look at exposure assessments, there's some simplified version. A lot of the subs we work on have had numerous court cases. After thousands of instances, they've worked out the details, how to do exposure really easily. A lot of substances don't, and they're more comprehensive versions. So we do the simplified versions often. We have done quite a few of the comprehensive versions of exposures, which are ones that are not as well tread or trod that substance through Prop 65 exposure. We primarily focus on preventing companies from getting in trouble, like avoiding the entire prosecution side, which I'll talk about. We've also done a lot in response to a plaintiff notice, a lot more the defense. So we do mostly prevention. We've had to also do quite a bit of defense. Basically, never for companies that we originally did the prevention for. If they follow, as long as they follow our instructions, we've had a few cases where we've told them to warn for something. It's very high risk, and they don't, and it goes afoul for them a couple years later. So, a little bit of history on Prop 65. It's the Safe Drinking Water and Toxic Enforcement Act of 1986, which is pretty old for a lot of these legislations. Like ROHS is 1996. This is 1986. It's a direct voter initiative. So in California, voters can directly create propositions. That's why a proposition here for California voters to vote on to become law. So it's created by referendum. It was enacted in November of 1986, so a long time ago. It's gone through a lot of evolutions. There's been multiple amendments, including some really important ones I'll talk about in 2025. So it's been around for a long time, but it keeps evolving, and there's some important evolutions that happened this year, which I'll talk about later on. So, a quick summary on Prop 65. If a consumer or a worker, a consumer can be a patient also, by the way, is exposed above the daily exposure limit in micrograms per day of a Prop 65 substance, the manufacturer is required to either remove the substance or provide a proper warning to the consumer or worker. There's a lot more complexity around it, but this is sort of the fundamental. If there's an exposure issue, you either have to get rid of the substance or provide a warning for it. What makes Prop 65 so unique is environmental violations in California, criminal violations of the environment can be prosecuted in civil court. So private citizens can enforce Prop 65 directly, which is very, very different, which creates a huge difference in enforcement levels where private citizens, often for economic reasons, can enforce it directly. Enforcements are public and searchable. So anything, by the way, you see that little purple link down below. If you get a copy of the slides, you can click on it and go to where you can find the Prop 65 notices. They're public, they're searchable, and there are roughly 400, usually over 400 in June of this year. There were over 400 prosecutions. So it's about over 400 prosecutions per month. That's a very different level of enforcement. So for ROHS in Europe, we see about 20 RAPEX notices a month. This is around 400. So easily the most enforced legislation in the restricted materials world. So very, very heavily enforced. 400 prosecutions or more a month. It's a lot. 12 months a year. We're up in the 5,000 prosecutions a year range. And it'd be things like this. I just put, these are all public, by the way. This was a steering wheel cover with DHP. There's a lot more to it, but they're saying, hey, the person touching the steering wheel cover, DHP is coming off in their fingers and they're ingesting it. And I'll go into more details about the exposure model, but that's basically it. So it'll be something like this, and the formats are different because again, the private prosecuting entities will be law firms. So they have their own format. This is the Consumer Protection Group did this one. This one is a different enforcing, usually law firm on behalf of usually an environmental entity organization. So this is for a milk with whey protein powder. It's got lead in it. Lead in food is pretty common at very low levels. in parts per billion. There's a number of different foods, whey being one of them, but definitely also things like cumin and turmeric that naturally absorb the lead and arsenic in the irrigation water. So it's pretty normal. There's a number of different herbs and other materials that uptake and retain lead in it. Rice does the same thing for arsenic. Basically, it has to do with the irrigation waters. Lead is pretty normal downstream for anything you open up the ground, anything downstream from mining. Super, super common. But this violates Prop 65. And there's a lot of prosecutions for food. There's a lot for physical products, and I'll talk about exposure, but this is a typical one. These are all from July of this year. Of course, as I mentioned, like 400 of these a month, so it's a lot. This is one of the very typical ones. It could be the whey, it could be the chocolate. It's often the chocolate themselves, the cocoa that's absorbing it. Um, the more cocoa you put in something, the more likely you have lead. Small amounts. It is a violation here, but it's not really at a dangerous level. Now, there are three different categories of exposure. I'll talk about routes, but first talk about categories. There's consumer exposure. A private citizen's exposed, like that person touching that brass pot, which in separate jurisdiction in Seattle or Kings County. Kings County used to be named after a different king, but Seattle then have changed it to now be named after Martin Luther King. Um, they actually were testing blood of children and finding that a number of different populations, their children had a sky high lead. An East Indian population, it huge relationship to these little brass pots. And in Prop 65, that lead that comes out that you touch or ingest is prosecutable. So if it's a private citizen, which includes things like patients, a patient and a medical, that's consumer exposure. That's one category. You can have an occupational exposure. So that's a worker or an employee. They have rights too. They're covered. However, they have more expectation of knowledge. They're expected as part of the job to more likely to read instructions, where a private citizen is not expected to read instructions. What that does is when you do warnings, it does change the standard of care for consumer, which is by and large deemed to generally be incompetent and idiot, and you have to take that into account. And occupational, like they might be incompetent and idiot, but at least their job says they're not supposed to be. So there's different rules about how to provide the warning. And then there's environmental exposure, like a car wash, stuff going down the drain. That's exposure of the air or water, drinking water. It's originally drinking water, but it also includes human exposure. So it includes all of these things. So where you could have a risk if you have a consumer exposure of a Prop 65 chemical, which is well over 900, above the daily exposure limit, I'll explain all that stuff. You have to either get rid of the chemical or provide a warning. Same thing with the occupational exposure. A worker or employee also matters. Your employees are covered by this. Other people's employees are covered by this. If you sell a medical device, the healthcare practitioner is covered by it. So it's not just, what the patient is exposed by, but the healthcare practitioner holding the handle or taking off the packaging. That exposure is in there. And of course, if you flush stuff down the drain, or you have an operation that flushes stuff down the drain or spits it up into the air, that's also in scope under environmental. So all three of these are in scope. Their warnings can be different because there's different sort of standards of care of what the expectation of knowledge and reading instructions are for these different people. And also environmental exposure. A person walking into the warning we had a minute ago for Disneyland is not necessarily expected to really understand the potential environmental exposures. So Disneyland has to have one for environmental exposures for a variety of reasons. They probably could fight a lot of it, but things like, if things are gas powered, the gas coming off it, and that kind of thing. So, compliance reminder, if exposure above daily limits for the substance is above the level, compliance involves either removal of the substance or the exposure. So you have leaded brass, you can go to lead-free brass. If you do that, the lead is gone. So there's no lead exposure. So you can get rid of it, or you can have an appropriate warning. Well, it's funny, you don't have to get rid of it, but if you don't, and there's an exposure issue, then you have to have a proper warning. And I'll talk about the proper warnings. And you've probably seen this in lots of products. It's California only, but of course, most people, whatever it's selling in California, they generally sell North America wide. So that's kind of the main parts about compliance, about what's in scope: consumer, professional, occupational, and the environment. Now, there are also four principal routes of exposure. There are more, Some of them are probably not for genteel company to explain all the other ones, but we're gonna go on these ones. Ingestion. You ingest it, eat it. Dermal absorption. It gets absorbed through your skin, which a lot of worker stuff actually is often around dermal. Inhalation, you inhale it. Also, a common thing, worker, if you're grinding or you're painting and stuff like that, inhalation. And then invasive. And there's actually not that many prosecutions in invasive. This is a direct human exposure. You've bypassed often the skin. But it's a more complicated topic, and it's actually not a lot of prosecutions on it. This route is the most common exposure route for both food products and physical products, like it's remote control. If it had an exposure issue, it would be around ingestion. People might say, "Well, I don't ingest the remote. I don't suck on it or suckle on it." No, it has to do with what comes off in your hands and you touch. And I'll explain hand, the touching, to mouth transfer. And of course, this is lunch and learn. And before everybody got food, I'm sure there was a longer lineup to wash your hands beforehand. And that'll actually come up in this part. What what gets on your hands, you ingest, whether it's chemicals, bacteria. If you ever get one of those disease that involves your poop not staying together anymore, it's looser. That's almost always fecal oral. Somebody else's poop has got your hand into your mouth, and that's pretty common. That's why I do. If somebody has like those kind of Norwalk type diseases, I generally have a variety of opinions on that. Now, if somebody else is preparing your food in a cruise ship, you may not be able to do much about that. That is definitely somebody else's poop getting in your mouth. Called fecal oral. It's a wonderful. You can Google it. Um, Inhalation. This is one of the most common exposure routes for chemicals, foot powders, paints. Like it's not the paint on the wall, but somebody has to spray that paint on. Or you often see warning in bags of plastic pellets for things like titanium dioxide and such. And we'll talk about titanium dioxide later, but that warning isn't really for the molded finished part that you have in your laptop or in your speakers or something like that. It's for the molder, the person pouring the flakes or powder into the mold. It'll kick up dust and they'll inhale the dust. So for a lot of chemical products, like the plastic pellets, before they get molded into whatever shape they end up being, that's inhalation. So these are the four main routes. There are other ones. You can use your imagination. But ingestion is the primary one for physical. You touch it, you touch your mouth, you ingest it. Dermal is one of the ones for wearable. If you wear something like a watch, it can be dermal absorption. And then inhalation is a lot of the chemical products. Things that are powders and flakes and gases and stuff like that are inhalation. You inhale it and it's into your lungs. So thermal absorption is rarely prosecuted because your skin does protect you very well from a lot of things, and invasive is very rarely prosecuted. I think it is quite prosecutable. It's just at a level of technical knowledge, and generally anybody they're going after invasive, the plaintiffs, they know they're going after a knowledgeable opponent with also deeper pockets. So it's not usually worth the effort to go after the medical for invasive. Medical for something they prosecute all the time, like direct contact, easier. Hierarchy of compliance. If I want to say, hey, my product is compliant, I don't have to do a warning. Here's the hierarchy. One, substance isn't there. It's pretty easy to be compliant for substance not there. So if you get non-detect using a reasonable test for concentration, you're off the hook. So if you test for lead with a test that should be able sensitive enough for the safe harbor limit or similar limit for exposure, and it gets a non-detect, then you're fine. So a non-detect for a reasonable test for concentration means the substance isn't there, you're off the hook. You didn't have to do an exposure test. If it isn't there, you don't have to worry about exposure. Next one is there's no exposure. It might be there, but there's no exposure. Either because there's no route for exposure, examples, it's inside the product and it's not coming out. The recycling worker, by the way, unlike ROHS, is not in this equation because you're responsible to communicate the warning to the next person in line. The consumer doesn't have responsibility to communicate it to the next person. They don't have to tell the garbage guy it's dangerous. It's not, they lose responsibility there. So if it's inside, yes, the recycling worker might grind it up and inhale it. That is beyond the communication. So internal part, nobody's touching it, nobody's inhaling it. In normal usage, sure, if somebody really wanted to, they can open up their laptop and start licking it. That is not normal. Not normal. Or the user always wear gloves. Very common medical devices. where they have instructions says wear gloves, then the hand to mouth transfer is gone. And well, unless they use the gloves improperly, they finish one of those exams and then go eat lunch with the gloves still on. That's really weird. That's not part of their job. Also kind of gross. Or you do a reasonable exposure test and it's non-detect. And I'll talk about the exposure test, but the exposure says no substance. Then you don't have to do this complex math. It's not there. Next level, so not being present substance isn't there at all. Awesome. Number two, there's no exposure. There's no way to touch it or get at it because it's inside, or you're wearing gloves. Or we did an exposure testing at non-detect. There is no exposure. That's second. Third is you have an exposure, but it's below a settlement limit. So with all these prosecutions, there's a lot of settlements. So for example, there's a wipe test, which I'll talk about. For lead, it's for hand to mouth transfer. If it's under 1 microgram, it's below the settlement limit, it's fine. There's a known test that's below that. And I'll talk a little bit about the settlement limits in a moment. Okay, what if it's not below the settlement limit? The next one is the exposures below MADL or I think it's NSRL. I got backwards here. I'll fix that later. These are the limits for reproductive toxicity and for cancer, respectively. And there are set limits. Basically, these are your daily exposure limits for reproductive toxicity, chemicals, or carcinogens. And the examples is lead is 0.5 micrograms per day. That is the reproductive toxicity limit for lead. If you have over 0.5 micrograms per day, it creates reproductive harm. And so that is, so if you do the exposure, and that's where the wipe test comes from. So you do the wipe test, and the reason the settlement limit's 1 microgram is that's how much is being the wipe. You're simulating, and I'll talk about the wipe test more, how much comes off in your hand. And then they'll talk about it where they rule that half of what ends up in your hand is ingested. So that means to get 0.5 micrograms per day, the wipe has to have twice that. If only 50% of what ends up in your hands. And that's where it comes from. So there's ways to do the math. Some of the math's already done for you, but the math's not done for you. You can figure out from the appropriate method and exposure how much they are exposed to inhalation or ingestion or whichever a day. And MADL is maximum allowable dose level, and that is lead's reproductive toxicity limit. Or it doesn't have, some substances don't have a maximum allowable dose level or similar. Nobody's calculated it yet. So you have to calculate it yourself. And there's ways to do that. Like you can calculate the no significant risk level, NSRL, from the no observable adverse effect limit for cancer. Those are often agreed upon. And if there isn't one done by California, there's usually a white paper where somebody else has done it. Otherwise, there's set methodology, not calculated, goes to how you do the calculations. So we can do all of these. We're starting to get deeper and deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. But that's why there's a lot of hierarchy. When you do tests off the bat, you don't have lead. You're good for Prop 65. Or you do have lead. We did an appropriate test, like a wipe test, non-detect, you're off. Or we did a wipe test, we have some, but it's below 1 microgram. Or we had to use another method that doesn't have a settlement, and the lead exposure is above 0.5 micrograms per day. Okay, you have to do warning. Or you got a substance like tetrabromide bisphenol A that doesn't have an NSRL. I fixed it in the bottom one there. I'll fix it in the final slides. It doesn't have an NSRL, and we've had to calculate the tetrabromide bisphenol A from its no observable adverse effect limit. But no observable adverse effect limit means somebody was dosing rabbits or most likely Lewis rats. And it's what point is the dosage level they saw something bad, whether it's cancer or cancer tumors. Usually it's just tumors or some level of reproductive toxicity issue. Reproductive toxicity issues either your ability to create children is reduced, or it affects the fetus, the child you're producing. And that's one of the most common reproductive toxins are ones that affect the child or fetus. Usually with things like attention deficit and good fun like that. Now, if you're using a settlement limit, there are two different grades. There are two options for settlements, and that link will take you to the page where you can look up settlements if you're into that kind of thing. So there's court-approved judgments where the government of California has done the prosecution, gone to court with it, and the court has approved the judgment. Those, like for example, are in lead in food. So when you're ingesting soup, the lead in food or lead in seafood or lead in oysters, that kind of thing, they're all set by judgments. And they're pretty well gospel. And once the court approves it, California has submitted it. The plaintiff, the defendant has settled on it, and it's approved by a court. It's pretty well gospel. It's pretty hard to argue situations against it in the future unless it's very different. So when you have court approved judgments, there's not a lot you can do about it if you disagree with them. That's just the way they are. There's also outer court settlements, which is the most common, where basically the plaintiff and because they filed but never went to court, the plaintiff defendant have agreed. There's a whole bunch of things that has to happen. The plaintiff, usually fees, because you have to pay some kind of fine to the plaintiff and also pay for their time. Mostly it's time, and they can put lots of time there at whatever rate they want. And the plaintiff has to show some benefit, like you're going to get rid of the substance or you're going to place a warning. Because they've gone through this process, it has to be still registered as an out of court settlement. So a lot of the rules for exposure levels are from out of court settlements. If there's a court approved, it comes first. If there's not a court settlement, it's next. It's generally very plaintiff friendly. Generally, at that point in time, the defendant just wants to settle. So they're definitely very plaintiff friendly. But even though they're plaintiff friendly, the enforcing guy, you can argue them, but it's pretty well an uphill battle. It's not gospel if it's not a court settlement, but it's a harder argument. So if you get to the point where you get an exposure and then you're looking at settlements, if it's court approved, you pretty well have to follow that one unless the situation is very different. Otherwise, you're looking at the out of court settlements. You can often argue parts of the out of court settlements. We do for a few things where they basically said it's A and B, and A is not applicable because B is these. So say it has to be this concentrate, below this concentration, and below this exposure. The exposure test is the critical one, not the concentration. So there are a few situations you can argue it, but generally, if there are settlements, you end up having to follow those. So it's two different levels. So this is the point when you have an exposure and you have a number, and before you start doing math, what are the settlement rules for that thing? So like touching a product with lead in it, there's lots of settlements. Like eating soup with lead in it, eating oysters with lead in it, so on and so forth. I don't, not because of the lead, because I don't like oysters. Um, Hand to mouth exposure. So this is probably the most common testing. And the rule is what is on your hands is ingested. So when you touch things, which hopefully there's a big line of people who before they eat lunch wash their hands, especially after like Blues Fest here, which is a petri dish. Under Prop 65, they assume the average American touches their mouth 8 times between hand washing. And that's actually conservative. It's probably worse. And from that, 50% of the material on your hands is assumed to be ingested. So you know when people like don't necessarily wash their hands after using the washroom, yeah, that's exciting because they're going to ingest it. But it could be anything. It could be whatever you've touched here on the table. You shake hands with somebody. You've touched your cup. 50% of that is assumed to be ingested. I always love the news stories where they say, "Hey, look, we do all this bacteria microbe testing on the cell phone. Look at all the microbes on it." Yeah, where do you think they come from? There, it's on your hands. It's you. It's not magic. Um, So it's 50% is ingested. And this could be chemical, it could be biologicals, it could be virus, it could be bacteria, it could be the main fecal oral poop to mouth transfer is often hands to food. And so there's a whole piece on it where, yes, things can get in your hand because you touch something like a carpet or flooring or the air drops stuff on your hand. Sure, a little bit, not much. Or more likely, surfaces. Hard surfaces hold chemicals quite easily. The outside of your cup, etc. And then the object can touch your mouth. You can transfer it's also hand to mouth if your cup transfers it, but most of it's around hand to mouth, where things you touch, what gets in your hand is 50% is assumed to go be ingested inside. And the way out from it, even with graph and Prop 65, is hand washing. That's the way out. Now, even if we do a lot of stuff in virus and they say, hey, this kills this more than that, hand washing also has the mechanical action of removing it, which is a big part of preventing exposure, especially for chemicals. I had one where I was talking about aluminum in our water supply, and somebody said, no worries, I boil my water. You just made the aluminum a little hotter. It doesn't kill aluminum. Sure, it kills microbes. So for chemical side, hand washing is particularly important because you can wash it off mechanically. You're not going to kill lead. It's pretty well going to kill you, not the other way around. You're not going to use soap to kill lead. Lead's lead. It's not. It's an element. It's not breaking down on you much. So you're going to mechanically wash it off. So that's why hand washing is a really big deal. Prop 65 guys made this. This is typical exposure. I did a presentation on this a couple months ago at the main occupational exposure people, and they're talking about all this, and we're all talking the lingo, and they all understand it was fantastic. And as I said this, I was the first presentation after lunch, which for most people put people to sleep. I wasn't putting people to sleep. I was having a fun run. But one of the comments, I'm like, okay, so we're all really experts as we understand hand to mouth transfer. Everybody who understands hand to mouth transfer, put up your hands. And basically everybody put up their hands. Okay. Okay. Okay, next question. Okay, we just had lunch. How many people wash their hands before lunch? There's like two people. I'm like, these are the experts in this field. You guys know better. Don't do that. Anyways, hand washing is important. So the way we do wipe, how do you simulate somebody's hand? It's using an occupational exposure. NIOSH is the Institute of Occupational Health and Safety in the US, or what's left of it. There's a standard, and link there, and you do a wipe test. You wipe with a wet wipe. The wet wipe is to simulate what comes off in your hands. So for polar substances, polar, you guys don't might not remember back to high school chemistry, polar are like water, where they have a negative end and a positive end. Most metals are polar. So for polar, like lead or cobalt, use water. The wetting agent, stuff on the wet wipe, is water because it comes off in water. It's a polar substance, are very attracted to water. Non-polar, the oils of the world, are not. They're repellent. I was like, when you have oil and vinegar, the reason your oil sits on top of the vinegar, the vinegar is water, polar, oil, non-polar. That's why they separate. So for non-polar substances like DHP, which is a big risk, or bisphenol A, the wetting agent we used distilled water with 6% artificial sebum. It is artificial oil. So you know when you touch something, you leave like fingerprints from oils behind. That's the often the oils from your sebaceous glands. You have little glands that produce oil. So the way your sweat works is most of the water of your sweat comes from the surface. Inside your pores, and also why it block pore grade 6 and stuff, is oils come out of there. Okay, so our artificial sebum simulates oil of the sebaceous gland. There's a link to an example sebum for this application. It's the oil in your pores. We have a simulated one. We don't like go around and harvest people's oil out of their pores. Like, okay, it's Tuesday. Everybody like squeeze the palms and see if we get some oil out. It's not like that. So this is generally the ingredients. There's a few acids down at the bottom. They're dangerous in the pure form, but not in low concentration. Oleic acid. I think that's the acid created by the crushing or making ants angry. And then stearic acid is basically stove. And then what's in it is mostly basically olive oil and palm oil and coconut oil and synthetic spermaceti. So spermaceti is a big part of it. Spermaceti is the synthetic spermaceti. Spermaceti, for those who don't know, I really, if now everybody's gonna watch this, I would have put this in the Claigan Olympics, which by the way, if you're not at Claigan, you're missing out. The Claigan Olympics, we have usually Claigan trivia. I would have put one for spermaceti. Unfortunately, I've already added it here. And a number of people I don't know what spermaceti is. I just like saying the word. Spermaceti is a waxy substance found in the head of sperm whales. That thing. That's the spermaceti organ right there. It's above their junk. Also called the melon. It's a real thing. So, back in the 19th century, and when they used to harvest or earlier, whales, they're going after the spermaceti organ. They're going after spermaceti, that oil. Realistically, you could have made similar oil for olive oil. So I think it's a bit harsh on the whale population. You guys are too lazy to make olive oil. But that's the spermaceti. And so that's the oil. Now, fortunately, we use that spermaceti right there. It's that part. It's above the junk. That's where spermaceti is. Unfortunately, we use the artificial version. We don't have to harvest sperm whales for this anymore. But when they were harvesting sperm whales, often like candles, they're going after that oil, which, considering it's very similar to olive oil, you think you just make more olives. Anywho, that's actually one of the main oils, and it's closer to human oil, and it kind of makes sense why it's really good for this application. There's an artificial version. The artificial version is basically coconut oil, for all intents and purposes. Okay, so that is for hand to mouth, and of course we use water. We're looking for things like lead, polar substances, and we use water or sweat with a bit of oil in it, sebum oil, and we're looking for non-polar things that only come out in oil. So like DHP only comes out in oil. Some substances are only a risk by inhalation. You have to inhale them because either the substance is volatile, like when you get, used to be the paint or shellac something, you get that smell as a volatile chemical. It's inhalation. You're in a small room painting with like old school shellac or whatever, or paint, and you're like, "Ooh, look at all the paint fumes." That's volatile. Most of those substances are Prop 65 substances. That's an inhalation risk. We're not really worried about the hand contact. You're worried about your inhaling it. So, for example, solvents like NMP, which we have in polyamide and stuff like that, um, or paints, or the substance is only a Prop 65 risk is inhaled. There are a number of substances that are only a Prop 65 risk for inhalation. They only cause cancer for inhalation. And that's like carbon black, titanium dioxide, and respirable silica. I'll talk about those. It's kind of an interesting way where it explains things that people don't necessarily explain to other people, like spermaceti. This is common for substances that cause cancer through physical damage. People are probably going, what do you mean cause cancer through physical damage? Most cancer is through physical damage. The damage is primarily caused by abrasion. It's like the asbestos. Asbestos is rock. It's chemically inert. You don't react with asbestos. It is little fibers that are insoluble, that are getting your lungs, and they are spiky, and they hack up your lungs and cause damage. They cause redness. So when they do testing on rats with asbestos, they know they're going to get tumors once they start giving them enough asbestos where they see redness or damage in the lungs. Of course, the fact they're seeing the redness in the lungs probably hasn't fared well for the mouse in general. So what ends up happening is one of the most common forms of cancer is physical, where you get a chronic or reoccurring wound. The wound tries to heal. And there's a lot of things involved in wound healing. And if you're young and healthy, generally it heals back into a healthy epithelium, healthy sort of skin or surface layer. Especially as you get older, it can get hijacked. And your wound healing pathway gets hijacked and you heal wrong. And that's cancer. And so for a lot of these, it's all respiration of particles. And that's actually how smoking generally causes cancer. Smoking cancer is not from, like, well, they say tar. And no, it's from the physical particulate that damage your lungs. Like when you can't breathe as well or your cough and so on and so forth. That damage, and it's not the damage that causes cancer, it's the healing from it. It's also why when you quit smoking, you generally have a higher cancer risk briefly. But once you heal it, you're fine, you're done, you're past that. But it's the constant damage done by smoking. People are like, well, if I quit smoking, I have a higher cancer risk. For that little window, yes. But then you're past it and you're good, especially if you're young. It helps if you're young. I mean, I'm not definitely saying quit smoking. It's a good idea, not just for cancer. You kind of smell worse than I do after 3 cups of coffee. So it's always worthwhile to quit smoking. Cancer is just one of the long-term advantages. Younger is better because you'll heal better. As you get older, you're like more likely to heal improperly and have cancer, and that's physical cancer. So these are almost all substances that cause um, cancer through abrasion. By the way, that's the same thing as like cancer from the sun. People are like, oh, is this complicated mutation? It's like an evil Harry Potter running around and making mutant zombie apocalypse. No, it's actually it damages your skin and it fractures and your skin has to heal the sunburn. And as you get older, or if you have a really bad burn, sometimes it heals wrong, and that's cancer. It's a physical cancer too. Um, so respirable particle testing, when we test one of these things, it's usually using it's a standard called OSHA 7500. It's using a PPI, which is a parallel particle impactor. You're like, well, that's a fancy name. Okay, what it really means is it's got holes. So it doesn't pump. And if you see on the left, you can see a little rubber nozzle, which is probably DHP'd PVC, but the little rubber nozzle, you actually take that off, the little black piece, you put a pump in it, and it sucks air through it. So whenever we do this, we always have a little pump going. And then you have the inlet plate, and then of course lets things into it. And it has, it's got little holes, so people don't touch it. Then it's called what? So then it has impaction substrates. And that's a really fancy name that I'm like, isn't that just the filters, the filter particles? Yes. Particles of larger size get interrupted on the way to your lungs because you only care for inhalation of what gets to your lungs. So there are particular filter sizes where the hole sizes are represented in the rules around that, representative of the particle size that can get to your lungs. Because below a certain, when they're too big, there are other things that will filter out. You have a lot of mucus and stuff like that will filter out the larger particles. Has to be respirable size, so it's usually small. So it goes through the impaction substrates, which are basically filters that filter out big particles that aren't going to make it to your lungs in real life. And then, oh, I went backwards. That's why. And then there's a bottom part that collects it. So what we're actually going to test is how much ends up on that collection filter at the bottom. Because it's basically a pump is sucking it through. And then there are these impaction substrates, which are basically filters that filter out the bigger particles. And then there's a another filter, which is much smaller particle size, and then it collects the airborne particles, and then we can measure it later. So what it's measuring is how much you'd be inhaling. And that's how you collect respirable particles. So that's inhalation. This is not what we do for VOCs for like a solvent. There's a whole other GCMS, it's called Headspace. Most of what we work on is the physical side of things, where we're looking at particles going through, where there will be carbon black and titanium dioxide. And I have incredible graphs for that, which don't seem to be in the presentation somehow. I'm going to sit there and wander back and forth for a second to see if I just missed it. Nope, it's not here. Oh well, I'll do better next time. So dermal exposures for long-term skin exposure. We don't do it as often, but there are certain things that are wearables. So wearables they wear for days are looking at dermal exposure. And primarily we're looking at nickel because nickel, the way nickel works is sure nickel is an allergen. But the reason nickel is an allergen is because it cuts up your skin. So nickel metal dissolves in the acid in your sweat. The water part, again, nickel is polar. Everybody knew that, based on everything else. And it dissolves in nickel 2 plus. Nickel 2 plus reacts to the proteins in your skin and chops up your skin, causes damage. And that's how it's a carcinogen. Is the damage caused, your body will heal. As you get older, sometimes you heal wrong. Now, because the nickel has chopped up your skin, it also binds the proteins. And once in a while, your body has, because the damage being done, misinterprets the metallo protein hybrid, the nickel protein hybrid is an allergen, creates an allergic reaction, immune response, allergic reaction. And that's how people get allergic to nickel. It's all related to the same thing. On the bright side, if they're allergic to it, they get a warning sign. They're much less likely to get cancer because their body will tell them they're touching nickel. But nickel chalks up the skin. You wear it long enough, it can do enough damage. And it's just math. Like how many times, most carcinogen is just how many times you do damage, roll the dice. And if you come up snake eyes, it's cancer. And as you get older, snake eyes turns out to be a lot easier to roll. And so nickel, maybe one, or bisphenol A. Bisphenol A, strangely enough, all the rules are around dermal exposure, wearable. So bisphenol A, and I think that's actually a bisphenol A free watch, but it's a neat example of a wearable. Um, so this is things that are long-term skin exposure. Nickel has got a particular mechanism where it cuts up the skin, and that's why it's a carcinogen. And it's not nickel metal, but it's the soluble nickel. And that's why probably if only soluble nickel is a carcinogen. Well, sure, any nickel metal in contact with your sweat is going to be soluble. You're going to get nickel 2 plus ions. So dermal exposure, the reasonable test, we normally use the EN 1811, which is used for wearables, usually for allergens. In Europe, it's a really good test. It's also fairly well proven out, done, probably hundreds of thousands of times. So it's what normally used for nickel, for allergen detecting. It's basically a 1 day soak in sweat. It's a little more complex than that, but that's mostly what it is. And it can be modified for other substances if appropriate sweat use. So nickel is polar. You can use basically slightly acidic water. Your sweat is generally slightly acidic. We actually have a program going on here where we're testing people's sweat to see how acidic it really is for this kind of purpose, like what comes out of it. Because a lot of the metals, the more acidic you are, your sweat more will come out. Or if it's a non-polar that doesn't give a rat's arse about water and it only cares about the oil, like bisphenol A, we have to use at least some sebum, the sebaceous gland oil again. So that is what we do for longer exposure. And this is mostly for wearables, things where the damage is done slowly over time, like nickel. And it's not a single touching. And nickel deep inside Prop 65, I think in the janitor's closet in a locked drawer, there's a passage in Prop 65 that says nickel is not a Prop 65 risk for ingestion. It's only for dermal. So that's why nickel always uses the dermal pathway. And that makes sense because what it's doing is just slowly chopping up your skin, the nickel. So products are compliant, again, if you don't have the substance or you don't have an exposure, or you can expose away as long as you put an adequate warning. So the requirement for normal sales is your warning has to be provided before exposure. It's fine as long as they see it. It's read and understood before exposure. Now, if a user can be reasonably sure to read the manual or safety data sheet, it could be in the manual or safety data sheet. But that's mostly just professionals because the average consumer isn't normally expected to read a manual. They can get the biggest complex blender in the world that, they could literally put in their iPhone and blend it, but they're not expected to read the instructions on how to use it. Professionals, because it's their job, is supposed to read the SDS. Now, if somebody reads safety data sheets, they're not written for any normal human being to understand. So it's kind of a bit of a funny thing. But they're expected to, so you can put it in the manual for a medical device. Like you shouldn't be doing, moving cancer tumors with endoscope unless you've read the instruction manual. Fair enough. They might not, who knows? But you're expected to read the manual. So professionals are expected to read the manual. So that's why you can put warnings in the manuals. Consumers are not, because professionals reading instructions is part of their job. Um, Otherwise, the warning should be either on the product or on the packaging or as an insert. And it has to be justifiable as being read and understood before exposure. Like you can't have font, you can't read. One of my favorite ones is like a shoebox where it's not on the outside, but when you open it, that little tucked in piece in the lid, it's written right on that. So when you open it, you see it. It's not before purchase, it's before exposure. So normal sales, non-internet, which is probably the normal sales now is internet, um, is you have to have the warning be read and understood before exposure, which can be like if you have a lid on like a shoebox and you open it up and it's on the flap that goes in. When you open it, you read it, you're not exposed to whatever's in the shoes yet. That's sufficient. Internet sales are a little bit differently. Um, the rule was that internet, it's much harder to return products from internet sales than it is from a brick and mortar sale, which isn't necessarily true anymore. But this legislation has been around since 1986. So the warning needs on internet sales needs to be provided before checkout, which can be on the product page, or it can be the word warning on the product page, a link to the actual warning, or actually either of the above on the product page or warning clearly displayed to the California residents before checkout, which means basically it could be there right away, or it could be, oh, I've entered in my zip code. Oh, you're from California. Here's the warning before checkout. So as long as you get it before checkout. So for brick and mortar sales, it's before exposure. For internet sales, it's before checkout. That's the difference. The warning has to be provided before checkout in international sales. Now, today, current warnings have specific language. There are new warnings coming. So you have to have warning in bold caps. You have to have the danger symbol, which has to be black on yellow, unless the location is no access to yellow. So if wherever it's being printed, there's no yellow access in that printing, it can be black and white. So it has to be yellow unless there's no yellow, then it can be black and white. And it has to have the government website. Okay, that's the starting point of today's. Now, it can be arranged in all different ways. Part two, it has to have specific warning text. That's the text for cancer and reproductive harm. It needs that one. That includes the cancer warning. If you have a carcinogen, if you don't have a carcinogen, you don't have to have a cancer warning, and the reproductive toxin. Lead is both, so it follows both categories. That's the reproductive toxin warning. Birth defects or other reproductive harm. If there's a reprotoxin. If you don't have, like, so you have DINP, it's the only phthalate that's carcinogen only. It doesn't have to have the reproductive harm listing. Antimony trioxide also is carcinogen only. Inhalation, most inhalation ones are carcinogen because they're chopping stuff up, not affecting your reproductive system. And has to be provided in all the languages, plural, not what's written there, but imagine this S there, on the location where it's placed. So if you have a text here that's French and Spanish, it has to be French and Spanish. You have to have both warnings, which makes it a bit exciting at times. The long form warning, if you put in the manual where you have unlimited space, so an insert can say you have limited space, you use short form. But if you have unlimited space, you have to use the long form today. And that long form, which is most just professional products that put in the manual, has to have a big long warning like that. The biggest difference is they have to identify at least one carcinogen and one reproductive toxin. That's the long form, only needed if wherever it's placed, like in a manual, has more or less unlimited text area. So an insert could also be argued to have to be small because of the packaging, it can use the short form. So if it's on the product, it's packaging, or as a small insert, it can use the short form. If you put in the manual, because it's a professional product, you have to use long form today. The long form has to identify a chemical. The short form does not. Now, this is all changing in 2028. One of the things people saw is that you just warn for everything, but nobody knows why. It's not helpful because also the government of California website has what you should do as a consumer when you see warnings for different chemicals. But the fact that short form today doesn't have to say a chemical, it's not a very helpful information. So the new short form warnings are required, not required, in 2028. They're for any product manufactured of January 1st, 2028. So difference between Prop 65 and say ROHS, the compliance date is when it's placed on the market in the EU. So it's basically when it's imported. California, it's the date of manufacture. Do not So it's not date of sale, not date of importation, the date of manufacture. So products manufactured after Jan 1st, 2028. The short form warning needs to include one carcinogen if applicable. That's not the simple as GHS. One reproductive toxin if applicable. That's just a fun warning. Or if it's like lead, which is both, you need both warnings. That's not the symbols for the Prop 65 warning. Those are just for representing carcinogen and reproductive toxin. So the new warnings are only for the short form. You now have options, which I'm not sure is helpful. Like saying you can do A, B, or C. Some people are like, just tell me what to do. You can put warning, which is the today version, CA warning, which funnily enough, everybody blames Canada now, or California warning. Now you need more space, but I go with that one, especially as a Canadian. Plus the usual warning symbol. And your standard choices for warning text. By the way, the warning symbol, you know the ones on the previous page, I like the GHS symbols for carcinogen or whichever. That was the first option. So for the carcinogen ones, you'd have to use the GHS symbol for cancer or for reproductive harm. And the California, OEA, the organ agency there said, well, we looked into it and the educational level in California is too low. So we're just going to put the exclamation point. That's a lot easier. Um, No, don't snicker if you're from Canada. We still have the old consumer warnings, the skull and crossbones, because the government determined that we're not bright enough to understand a change to GHS, unlike, say, US and Europe. Um, so the standard choices for the warning text are you have two choices now. You know, of the warning text, risk of cancer and reproductive harm from exposure to, name the chemical, and then the government website, or it can expose you to, name of chemical, a carcinogen and reproductive toxin. You have a choice. I'm not sure how that's helpful, but you have a choice. The big new difference, though, you have to name a chemical. And if you if you have 12 carcinogens, you only have to name one carcinogen. You have 47 reproductive toxins, you just have to name one reproductive toxin. You have a chemical like lead that's both a reproductive toxin carcinogen, it checks both boxes. There are some variations to this text if it's only a carcinogen like DIMP or only a reproductive toxin like BPA. There are some variations, but this is the most common. So this is, like example, the new warning. It's got the symbol. It's got this is option warning phrase 2, CA warning. That's the warning language option 1. That's the substance that qualifies the carcinogen as reprotoxin. That's lead. And that's the government website. And so that's the modern warnings come 2028. So summary, Cal Prop 65, if a consumer worker is exposed above the daily exposure limit in micrograms per day of a Prop 65 substance, the manufacturer is required to either remove the substance or provide a proper warning to the consumer or worker. Private citizens can enforce Prop 65 directly. Enforcements are public and searchable. There's over 400 prosecutions a month. The new warnings are due January 1st, 2028. And I'm going to get into a section. We'll do Q&A in a moment. If you have any questions, you can submit it in the control panel, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. If I don't get to yours, I obviously just skimmed over it because I have sort of infinite time when I'm recording. So Claigan has provided Prop 65 compliance for thousands of products for justifying why you don't need a warning, or if you do need a warning now, you have to know the substance, what substance in it is it. We've done exposure assessments because of all the settlements. Often they're simplified. It's set piece battle, like that hand to mouth contact stuff. Or if it's newer substance or more argumentative, we've done much more comprehensive versions. We focus heavily on preventing you from getting into trouble if you listen to us, which most companies do most of the time. Then when they don't, they get in trouble. Or in response to a plaintiff's notice. We do far fewer of those, but we still do a lot. Where basically, oh, look, we didn't do a warning. We got hit. What should we do? And then there's a lot of ways to handle that. It's a different mechanic. Um, any questions? And as I look at the Q&A panel, there it is. Great question. Oh, what happens if you have a product after January 1st, 2028 on the California market and it doesn't have the updated warnings? As long as it's manufactured before January 1st, 2028, that's fine. So the data manufacturer is very important. What if you don't have the data manufacturer? For a lot of products, it's written on it. You just have to have reasonable proof what the data manufacturing is. We've had a couple where, hey, look, you have phthalates in your earplugs. We got at a gun range in a bucket. And we've worked with a company and we did Prop 65 work for them years before, and they don't have DHP in their earplugs for years. They designed it out. And the one they're pulling out of a bin, is probably half a decade old, and that doesn't count. So it is from the date of manufacture. So A lot of good questions. How do you handle the fact there's over 900 substances in Prop 65? A lot of them are things like pharmaceuticals, and they're not a risk to you. And most of the ones in physical products have been well trod. People have tried out many, many things. With 400 prosecutions a month, the plaintiffs will try out pretty well everything. So a lot of the substance, it's much more of a set piece battle now, where everybody has agreed upon what the rules are and how to approach those rules. So it's usually a lot simplified. There's usually about only a dozen Prop 65 substances that are significantly important, and there are ways to handle those. Because they not only have to be there, they have to be there in a concentration above that can create exposure above their levels. So it does really limit which chemicals are really a risk. One of my favorite is the prosecutions for alcohol for creating birth defects. Fair enough. It's a well-known thing now. So if you're selling alcohol or whichever, you have to have a warning. And if you don't, this has been around for over a decade, this particular prosecution. It is what it is. Oh, perfect. And like everything, anybody's got any other questions, feel free to ask afterwards. There's a lot to take in, especially a lot of the chemistry type stuff. And of course, looking at cancer, it is one of the things I always find really interesting is a lot of the cancer stuff is physical, where it's done damage to you. Like you can see the wound. It's wound healing. Like when you get wounded, sometimes you don't heal right. And it's more if it's a chronic wound where it's constant abrasion or that kind of thing. That's why talc is asbestos with better marketing. When you talc itself is not terribly, it's chemically inert, but if you abrade yourself with it, rub it against you, and you create redness, redness is skin damage. You do this over and over again, the math is not in your favor, and cancer is a risk. So perfect. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks for everybody here who organized the food. It was fantastic. And Claire, who stayed up past midnight to actually make us fresh cookies. By the way, if you're watching the recording later, you missed out. Again, thanks everyone, and I look forward to talking to everyone again soon.